Hello and welcome to Study Project. Today we are covering International A-Levels, A2 Biology Unit 4. The topics are climate change, evidence for climate change, climate models. So, our first heading is what is climate change? But before we can answer this question, we have to know the definitions of the following. So what is weather? Weather is the conditions in the atmosphere at any given time. This is short term. For example, rain. Climate is average weather over a large area over a long period of time. This one is long term. And then you have greenhouse gas. So greenhouse gas, some examples include water vapor, carbon dioxide, methane. These are gases that are found in the Earth's atmosphere that prevent heat loss from the surface of the Earth. And then you have the greenhouse gas effect, and this is the way in which heat or infrared radiation is trapped close to Earth's surface by these greenhouse gases. So climate change and global warming, but what's the difference? Climate change is a large-scale change in global mean weather patterns and temperature that occurs over a long period of time. And global warming is the increase in mean global temperature over a long period of time, mainly due to increasing levels of greenhouse gases. But what are the effects of global warming? Why do we need global warming and greenhouse gases? If there's a natural amount of greenhouse gas, then this is good because it provides heating to sustain life. But if there's too much greenhouse gas, this leads to an abnormal increase in temperature of Earth, which leads to problems such as the following. Icebergs melt, sea levels rise, and this leads to extreme weather conditions. But how does global warming occur naturally? So global warming occurs naturally by the following steps. You should remember these steps in this order. So UV light is emitted from the sun. It passes into the Earth's atmosphere. UV light gets absorbed by the Earth's surface. This UV light then gets reflected back into space as infrared radiation. But not all infrared radiation escapes Earth's atmosphere. Some infrared radiation gets trapped in Earth's atmosphere by greenhouse gases, methane, carbon dioxide, and water vapor. This infrared radiation gets re-emitted back into the Earth's surface, and this means global warming occurs. So I drew a picture so you can follow along with the steps. So for the first step, number 1, UV light gets emitted from the sun. UV light passes into the Earth's atmosphere. And then on to number 2, UV light gets absorbed by the Earth's surface. And number 3, UV light then gets reflected as infrared radiation as represented by these waves. For number 4, some infrared radiation gets trapped in the Earth's atmosphere due to the greenhouse gases. And number 5, this infrared radiation that gets trapped gets re-emitted back into the Earth's atmosphere. And number 6, it increases Earth's mean temperature, and this causes global warming. What are human factors that enhance the greenhouse gas effect? These are 3 main factors: deforestation, fossil fuel combustion, and agriculture. But how does deforestation lead to global warming? So less trees means that there's less photosynthesis, meaning less carbon dioxide can be taken in from the atmosphere by these plants by photosynthesis. But how does deforestation even occur? Machinery that is used to cut down the trees uses fossil fuels, and fossil fuels are combusted, and this releases more carbon dioxide, and this means that there's more greenhouse gases in Earth's atmosphere, and this means there's an enhanced greenhouse gas effect. But how does fossil fuel combustion lead to global warming? Again, similarly, combustion of fossil fuels lead to more carbon dioxide being released, leads to more greenhouse gases in Earth's atmosphere, and this leads to enhanced greenhouse gas effect. But how does agriculture lead to global warming? So you have 2 main types. So you have rice fields and cattle farming. So rice fields are waterlogged for long periods, and in the soil it contains anaerobic bacteria, and these bacteria release methane. And methane is a stronger greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, and so this means that there's an increase in greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, so the greenhouse gas effect is enhanced. And then you have cattle farming. Cattle farming requires a large slot of land, and to acquire this, you need deforestation. This means less trees, less photosynthesis, less CO2 being taken in from the atmosphere. And then you have machinery that is used to cut down these trees in the first place. And these machinery uses fossil fuels. Again, combustion, more CO2, more greenhouse gases, and onwards. Cattle farming, another part of it, is that there's high emissions of methane. Again, methane is a greenhouse gas, so this leads to more greenhouse gases in the Earth's atmosphere. So this means there's an enhanced greenhouse gas effect. On to the next heading, evidence for climate change. So there are 5 evidences that we have to run through, which are listed right now. So let's start with the first one, dendrochronology. So dendro meaning tree and chronology meaning time. So dendrochronology, the dating of past events using tree ring growth. This basically means it dates the tree rings to the exact year that they were formed and what climate conditions the tree rings were formed in. Tree rings are annual growth rings that show the amount of wood produced during the growing seasons. As you can see in the image below, this is a trunk and the circle-like things are tree rings. Again, the oldest tree rings are in the inner trunk. These are some things you need to know about dendrochronology. So tree rings can be different colors and can be different widths. So tree rings can either be light and thick or dark and thin, and I'll explain why. So tree rings that are light and thick tend to have fast growing speed because they grow in seasons like spring and summer where the conditions are warm and wet. This means the temperatures are warm and optimal for growth, meaning that photosynthesis rate is at the maximum, and this means that growth occurs the most, and that's why tree rings are thicker. And for the other one, dark and thin, growth speed is slow, and this is because the growing season in autumn, which is dry and cold, temperature is cooler, and these are bad conditions for growth. The reason why these are bad conditions, something cool is not good for the rate of enzymes, and dry, there's not enough water, and water is needed for photosynthesis, and photosynthesis is used to make the tissue for the tree rings. So because of these conditions, we get thin tree rings. Again, you have to remember that the width of tree rings provide a measure of the climate during that tree ring growth season. This is an image of tree rings, and you can see in the very center is the first year of growth. This is the first tree ring form, and as you can see around the first year growth, the tree rings around it all have different colors, being light and dark, and have different thicknesses. As you can see, the rainy season is light and wide, but the dry season is dark and thin. And you have to remember that 1 year of seasonal growth is shown by one light and one dark tree ring. But how can dendrochronology provide evidence for climate change in the first place? So as temperature rises and rainfall increases, global warming and climate change occur and increase. So conditions are warmer and wetter, making it more optimal for growth. This means maximum photosynthesis, more growth. So the newer tree rings get wider and lighter. But to get samples for dendrochronology, you don't need to use the tree trunk of a dead tree. You can use a tree corer to get samples of the tree without killing the tree. So there are limitations to dendrochronology, and this includes trees that don't grow. So that means in these specific regions, there's no tree rings to use to determine the climate. But some trees, for example, rainforest trees, can grow all year because the climate conditions are the same. So this means the tree rings are the same width throughout the year. So you cannot use it to determine the climate. And some species don't even have tree rings. So again, you can't use this. On to the next evidence. Next evidence is ice cores. So what is an ice core? An ice core is a sample of ice taken by drilling into glaciers or ice sheets. But how are they used? This depends on how old the ice core is. Ice cores can have different number of layers, and each layer has air trapped inside. This air can be used to analyze and calculate the temperature and the carbon dioxide concentration at that particular time. Again, the deeper the layers, the older the layer. How can ice cores provide evidence for climate change? As climate change continues, carbon dioxide levels increase and atmospheric temperatures increase. So this means newer ice core layers will contain higher carbon dioxide concentration and higher atmospheric temperature. On to the next evidence, atmospheric carbon dioxide. So there are two main contributors. There's natural kinds and the human kind. So for the natural kinds, you have volcanic eruptions, wildfires, limestone weathering, outgassing from the ocean. And for human contributes, you have fossil fuel combustion, agriculture, and deforestation. In this graph, you can see there is the CO2 concentration on the y-axis and the years or time on the x-axis, and you can see that over the years there are annual fluctuations, and this is normal. Here there's high fluctuation, and you can see here there's a low fluctuation. However, as you can see up here, this is abnormal fluctuation. So what are the natural reasons for fluctuations in the atmospheric carbon dioxide graph? So you have high points. High points are from volcanic eruptions. Large carbon dioxide emissions occur. These emissions tend to cover the light from the plants. No light means no photosynthesis, means less or no carbon dioxide is being taken in by plants. And the low point is usually in the summertime, where there's maximum sunlight, there's maximum light absorption from plants, so there's maximum photosynthesis, meaning there's maximum carbon dioxide being taken in for photosynthesis process. But how can atmospheric carbon dioxide graph provide evidence for climate change? So as carbon dioxide increases throughout the years, this increases the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, enhancing the greenhouse gas effect. And as well as this, global temperature increases simultaneously to this, and this leads to global warming and climate change. As you can see here, the concentration of CO2 increases, the temperature also increases. So there's a correlation here. But is atmospheric carbon dioxide a correlation or a causation? So the thing that makes it a correlation is that as carbon dioxide increases, this reflects the increase in global temperature. So this is a strong correlation. As carbon dioxide increases, global temperature increases. But the causation is that carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, and we know as a fact that greenhouse gases leads to global warming. So this proves that an increase in carbon dioxide leads to global warming. On to the next evidence, average global temperature. How to measure the average global temperature? So we use a thermometer to measure the air temperature from different areas or places over long periods of time, and then work out the average global temperature divided by time. As you can see in this graph, over time, the global temperatures have increased massively. On to our final evidence, pollen grain preserved in peat bog. So what even is a peat bog? Peat bog is a wetland that is very acidic, anaerobic, and cool. This is made when peat builds up in layers. What is peat? Peat is partially decomposed plant matter that accumulates over time, and this forms layers. Note that peat bogs can also be used as fossil fuels because it burns and releases CO2, even more than that of coal. But what's the effect of the peat bog properties? As mentioned, anaerobic means that there's no oxygen, so this kills off the aerobic decomposers. And it's cool, so the rate of decomposition decreases. And it's acidic, so it means it kills off the decomposers that are sensitive to acidic conditions. So the result of this is that the peats are partially decomposed, and this helps preserve the pollen grains, because without these conditions, pollen grains would have decomposed. And again, the older the layer, the deeper the layer. So how do you analyze peat bogs? So peat cores are taken and examined through a microscope and analyzed. And you analyze the layers of the peat core and assess the pollen grain in the peat core. You want to remember that pollen grains of each plant species are different and are unique. And different plant species grow in different climatic conditions. So how can pollen grain be used? So plant species that grow in different climates will have their pollen grain in different layers. When these pollen grains are analyzed, you use the DNA inside the pollen grain to identify the species. And then from this, you can determine the climate it was grown in, because as mentioned, different species thrive in different climates. For example, in one peat bog situation, let's say the bottom layer is around 10,000 years old. A pollen grain is found here, DNA is analyzed, and the plant species 1 is determined. And this plant species preferred growth conditions were wet and cold. So this means that the climate 10,000 years ago was wet and cold. And for the top layer, for example, 100 years old, a pollen grain is found, DNA is analyzed, plant species 2 is determined. And instead of the conditions being wet and cold, the conditions are dry and warm. But how can pollen grain preserved in peat bogs provide evidence for climate change? As global warming and climate change occurs, temperature rises, and this means that more pollen grains of plant species that prefer to live in warmer conditions will be present, while less pollen grains of the plant species that prefer to live in cooler conditions will be less present. On to our next heading, climate models. So what are climate models? Climate models are computerized simulations that uses complex mathematical equations to investigate and represent the atmospheric climate system over time. But what is even in a climate system? So you have the ocean, air, and land, and it shows how energy and matter interact in different regions. In the image below, you see a climate model. How do you use a climate model? So a climate model recreates the past weather and climate conditions accurately, and extrapolation of these past events are used to predict the future climate conditions. And from this, you can test a hypothesis. But what are the benefits of climate models? You can predict the future climate changes, make decisions for the futures, and help set mitigating targets. However, what are the limitations for climate models? It is too simple to make accurate predictions because it does not consider unknown factors. Some processes in the climate are just way too complex to measure accurately, and it does not include wind and rain patterns. So it's impossible to find the exact impact of global warming on certain aspects of the world. So this is an example of a climate model. As you can see, these grids, they represent different climatic regions. The smaller the grid, the higher the resolution. These are more examples. On the left-hand side is a more simple example showcasing the weather patterns here. And on the right side, you can see an example where the x-axis is the years, and you can see that an extrapolation has been made to predict the future for CO2 emissions. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for the next videos.